I can see this is going to be a rambunctious crowd. It's all because of Claire crying.
Wide-ranging.
Good afternoon and thanks for coming. I'm Tanya Zanish-Belcher, Director of Special Collections and Archives, and we are so pleased to have our guest today, Dominique Luster. She is this year's Samuel T. Gladding Fellow in Special Collections at Wake Forest University. In addition to serving as the Samuel T. Gladding Fellow this year, Dominique has also been conducting oral histories with a number of Wake Forest Black alumni, both online, and some of which were in person today, tomorrow, and Friday. Thank you, Dominique. And before I introduce her further, I did want to talk a little bit about Sam Gladding, for whom this program is named. Many of you knew Sam, and for those that didn't, I want you all to know how special he was. He was a counseling professor who wrote over 18 books, 32 book chapters, 92 articles, and 45 poems. He was a Wake Forest administrator. He served as a mental health responder for 9/11 and the mass shooting at Virginia Tech. He was a researcher, a writer, a husband, and a father, and as one of his colleagues described him, a gentleman and a scholar. He was a supporter of Special Collections and Archives, and when he passed away, he left a generous donation for us. This donation, which we are using to support humanities programming, allows us to honor Sam and also give back to the Wake Forest students, staff, and faculty, as well as the Winston-Salem community. I also wanted to give a special acknowledgement and thank you to Mrs. Claire Gladding, who's in the audience today. Thank you for coming. Special thanks to Megan Mulder, Special Collections Librarian, Rebecca May, Public Services Archivist, for their work on this event, and Barry Davis, who I just call IT expert, for assisting with interviews and coordinating the online experience for those of you who are online. This presentation is also being live streamed and recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. And we hope that you'll join us for a reception afterwards in room 625 with many, many, many Trader Joe's snacks. And now more about Dominique. I mean, you got to mention the Trader Joe's, right? There are Dunkers, we should tell you. Dominique is the CEO and Principal Archivist for the Luster Company. Excuse me. She is a professional archivist, researcher, and storyteller, and loves finding new and innovative ways to use information, technology, and primary sources to tell stories and solve problems. Dominique received her BA from the University of Kentucky and her MLIS from the University of Pittsburgh. She was the Teenie Harris Archivist for the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, 2016 to 2021. In her consulting work, Dominique is drawn to big ideas involving diverse histories, public engagement, strategic thinking and planning, and project management. Her research looks at various archival and historiographical approaches to Black identity, representation, and silenced records. So I'm going to turn this over to you. Is that a lot of pressure? Dominique.
Oh, thank you. That was very, very kind. I didn't know she was going to read all of that. I just wanted to say thank you for having me today and for inviting me down. I did not know all these people were going to come, and so I'm just really honored and privileged that you would come spend the last bit of your time on a Wednesday with me. I will be before you long, but I did want to just make sure I said thank you to the University, for Wake Forest, for inviting me here, and for all of you for coming on today in the afternoon. I am very Southern, so I will move. I will talk a lot. I'd prefer if you talk back to me. I want us to have a conversation. I am not going to present a PowerPoint or things like that. I'd really want us to kind of, I have some questions that I'd like to pose, and I'd love for all of us to kind of dig into those and wrestle with them together, if that's okay. But first, I am an archivist, so I brought a book. And if you're curious, that's my face on the back of the book. My name is on the front. But I will be reading from a little bit of the book called In Relentless Pursuit of Me, Upending the Unicorn Effect. I was invited to participate and contribute a chapter to a book around the unicorn effect, which is essentially a phenomenon in which Black women particularly experience extreme amounts of pressure to perform under undue circumstances that maybe our other colleagues may not have or face, and yet still succeed and still have expectations and still rise to certain challenges. And I was drawn to write about the experience of how I became an archivist and the challenges or experiences that I faced in that situation and environment. However, today I'm actually going to be reading a small excerpt from a colleague of mine's chapter in the beginning of the book. She's just a very dear woman, and I'm going to read a little bit and then we'll talk about it, and I hope you enjoy. So, New Orleans flooded. Hundreds of thousands of residents, some with the means and some with only what they could carry, loaded up their vehicles and evacuated. 2 days after the flooding, Katrina unleashed 100-mile-per-hour winds, and the city was underwater because of the breached levees and slow response. Nothing would ever be the same. These were not ordinary times. This was in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Everyone was anxious and scared, uncertain, uncomfortable, suspicious, angry. Local, state, federal government had let people down, had let New Orleans down. The world watched from the front row seat and witnessed the devastation, disappointment, abandonment, and loss. But not everyone left. Some die-hard New Orleans refused to allow storms, no matter how ferocious, to run them away. Too many didn't even have the option of fueling their cars because they had no cars. They had no money and no way to get out. Many ended up at the Superdome or the Convention Center. The federal government and others took too long to get their response efforts together. When the levees broke, people drowned. Respondents rescued traumatized residents from their gathering places. Some had to be airlifted from their rooftops or overpasses in the blistering late August sun. Those who fled for safety were scattered around the country and were called refugees, criminals, and those New Orleans people. Monica, my colleague, is a producer, radio host in New Orleans, and she wrote about the experience of evacuating up to Baton Rouge during such a critical time, and what it was like watching all of this happen, trying to get home, but what do you get home to? And, you know, as many of us in this room can imagine, this isn't fiction. Maybe you lived there, maybe you're from New Orleans or Louisiana, maybe you have family members that are from New Orleans or Louisiana, so you know the realities of these stories. It's not fiction, it's very real. And so one of the questions that I've been struck with recently is what happens to families after hurricanes, fires, floods, earthquakes, tornadoes. We were just talking about that. And in those moments of loss, what becomes and what will remain? So when Hurricane Katrina tore through New Orleans, the losses were quite truly everywhere. Quite truly everywhere. I've heard stories of someone who evacuated about 2 hours north, and they remembered seeing on the news just water in streets, like you could just see water. And they mentioned to me that they grew up in New Orleans, they're from New Orleans their whole life, and they could not recognize even what side of town they were looking at on the television. And the only reason that he could figure out where he was looking was because on the light pole, on the intersection on the light pole, there was the green street sign hanging from the light pole, and when the cameras from the helicopter zoomed in, you could see the street name on the light pole a couple of feet above the water line. That is what they were dealing with. And when families shifted through the remains, when the water receded, families were looking for their photographs, for their family Bibles, for their shoebox full of letters from World War I. Anything that could connect them back to their lives before the storm. And most for most people and for most families, there just really wasn't anything left. Anything that they may have had probably floated away, and it was really difficult for them to put things back. But I say this because it wasn't just the private lives that were shaken. Libraries, archives, and universities also suffered severe damage. I remember a colleague of mine mentioning that at Tulane, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Tulane University, their library, a hole ripped in the roof of the library. A hole ripped through the roof of the library. And water, like rainwater, started flooding into their collections. And there was weeks without power, which turned the books and manuscripts, made them very vulnerable to mold, as I'm sure we're all aware is possible. At LSU in Baton Rouge, the library transformed more of them for books, but also into a safe spot for evacuees. The library just began helping and taking in people that needed a place to be. And it became a safe space, not just a source of knowledge, though it tried to do that as well. At the University of New Orleans, the Special Collections Library, thank goodness, did not flood, but it did lack air conditioning because of the power outages for several weeks in the harsh Louisiana August-September sun, and they reported that their microfilm collections began to buckle. And mold began to develop on a lot of their rare materials. Now, these institutions did not escape untouched. They limped forward, right? And they relied on emergency grants, volunteers from across the country, archivists and librarians who really showed up to kind of support our institutions. National preservation projects launched off the ground, for the critical difference between the institution and the family was that the family did not have the same preservation resources to jump in the act as the universities and institutions did. One library may have lost their microfilm reels, and that is hard enough. But one family lost every photograph of their children. That is the inequity that I've been wrestling with at the heart of these conversations and at the heart of this conversation that I'd like us to have. Institutions, even when damaged, have infrastructure, they have insurance, they have professional staff, and sometimes even national rescue efforts to come in. Families have none of that. Their archives are their closets and their basements and their shoe boxes under the bed. And when disasters come, they have no backup plan. Their personal collections simply vanish. So that brings me to the question that I want us to discuss. If personal memory is so fragile, what role can archives play when individuals have lost everything? What value can archives hold in the aftermath of such devastation? So a few weeks ago, this question is coming up because a few weeks ago I had an opportunity to meet with a friend of mine, Eddie Francis, who hosts the Way Forward radio station, and he had specifically wanted an archivist. He called it an archivist. He specifically wanted someone to come in on the radio and talk because it was the 20th anniversary, or we had recorded it several weeks in advance, but we were looking to air this episode on the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And he posed a question, and I do a lot of talks, and people don't often catch me off guard. It was a really excellent question. And during the interview, he asked, and I wrote it down, what is the value of archives to people who've lost everything? What's the point? He went further, being Black communities, marginalized communities, especially in New Orleans. There wasn't anything about us in the archive in the first place, and everything we may have had has been washed away. So what's the point? And I remember sitting there, because I truly was stumped. I thought I wanted to honor his question as, it was a very vulnerable question. What's the point? He personally wasn't saying, I don't care about archives, but for this greater community, he's asking, well, if my community story isn't reflected in the archive, and everything that I've had was washed away, then why should I care? What's the point? And it truly stumped me, and because I'm an archivist, so I inherently believe in the value of archives. Like, I will stand on this hill. I believe in value of archives. And he just kept, well, why? Why should I care? Eddie Francis is a fantastic person. We were just trying to move through this conversation. And I couldn't shake the question, and so when Tanya in the library invited me to give this talk, it was like a day after I'd done this interview, and I was still 24, 48 hours later, still wrestling with it because I truly didn't have a great answer. I personally believe in history and history making and legacy keeping and telling stories for future generations, and archives and documents being able to provide evidence to those stories. But he still made a good question. What is the value of archives to the individual who has lost it all? And to be honest, it's been about a month since that recording, and I still do not have an answer. I just want to be honest. So today, I'm hoping that we can collaboratively talk through out loud my ideas and my thoughts, and maybe some of your ideas and thoughts. And that maybe we could have a conversation together. And I've said this several times in TED Talks, and I say it all the time, and I'll say it again, but I believe that archives have the power to uplift some and oppress others. It can be a tool that is used in whichever way it is applied. And after hurricanes in Louisiana, after fires in the Palisades, archives, I believe, might have the potential to become lifelines. So I have 4 ways or ideas. Like I said, these are my thoughts and ideas. I don't have a true answer, and I don't wish to put forth myself as the speaker on the answer. But I have 4 ways in which I believe archives could become lifelines. Could. We'll see. First is about identity. Straight identity. When birth certificates and marriage licenses and school records have been destroyed or lost, archives can provide proof of existence, proof of evidence of such actions, interactions, existences. Right? They've helped people reestablish their identity in the eyes of the law, the state, or the community. From a fundamental perspective, I do understand that it may not allow for the reestablishment of your personal identity, but simply your existence. Archives can help reestablish that. However, I do also think a small part of it can also offer healing. Survivors can potentially find comfort in items such as yearbooks, oral histories, church newsletters. And sometimes it wasn't the official record that mattered most, though it does. Birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, we absolutely know that matters. What I'm suggesting is that sometimes that's not the only thing that matters. Sometimes hearing a familiar voice in an interview or seeing a photograph of the block that no longer exists, sometimes, in my opinion, those fragments remind people that they have been here. And sometimes just remembering that you have been here allows the brain to take a step to say, okay, well, I was here and that I mattered. Third way that I believe archives could become a lifeline is in the rebuilding phase. Archives hold practical tools of survival and thriving. This ranges based on the repository, but it could include anything from deeds, court records, as we mentioned, yearbooks, insurance files, business licenses. Depending on the type of archive, could vary on the rebuilding of life, communities, and culture. And speaking of culture, I believe the final way that archives could become a lifeline is the continuity of culture. In cities like New Orleans, where tradition is everything. I have family that lives there, tradition is everything. Archives, even in the personal memory or the institutional memory, preserved the memory or the experiences of the Mardi Gras crews and of the jazz musicians and the teachers unions and the neighborhood associations, so that even if the house was gone, the story and the community still endured. But there's a challenge here that I still was like, that sounds all really good. It lands so nice, doesn't it? And I still couldn't just let it sit. Tanya will tell you, I'm a bit of a rebel rouser when it comes to archival stuff, so I just couldn't let it sit, and I thought there's a challenge, and it struck me finally what it was, and that value that I'm describing in those previous 4 points is not evenly distributed. Not every survivor knew where to turn, and not every archive saw serving individuals as its mission. More, not every institution was prepared to step into that role at that time. So no matter how many documents an archive can provide, personal loss was still lost and never fully replaced. You know, an archive could maybe, if you have a really historic home, maybe an archive can give you evidence of that home, but can it give you back the smell of your grandmother's kitchen? And that's the part that I kept wrestling with. You know, an archive, as a photo archivist, an archive can show you a photograph of your neighborhood, but it can't hand you back the family Bible, where, at least in my family, every birth and death and marriage is on the first couple of pages, usually like for pages and pages you can track family events in the family Bible. That's gone, floated, gone. That kind of loss is extremely intimate and it cuts deep. And that kept bringing me back to Eddie's question, what is the value of archives to those who've lost everything? If there's nothing left to be saved, what else could be preserved? And this is where I kind of am like, okay, I hear you. I think oral histories kind of come in here. This is where I find some level of peace in oral history traditions. Because when the physical artifacts are gone, the voice can still remain. The story remains. The ability to sit across from someone and ask them to tell their story remains. In their own words, in their own rhythm, in their own style, with their own inflections, their memory is too now captured, even if the family Bible has washed away. And after Katrina, when whole neighborhoods got washed away, when the survivors finally did, sometimes months, sometimes years later, finally did sit down to tell their stories, they told stories about evacuation, about loss, about rebuilding, but they also told stories about hope. And those stories become archives of the survival. They become proof that life happened, that culture persisted, and that many didn't drown in the storm. And so I think personally as an archivist, I think there's an ethical weight to oral history work because we can't bring back people's shoeboxes full of letters, but we can make sure their voices, their stories, and their presence don't disappear. Now, I am not suggesting that oral histories can erase grief or replace what was lost or what was never preserved in the first place, but that's a talk for a different conversation. But they can create a bridge from silence to story. So if oral histories do hold that kind of power, and that's an if, but if oral histories do hold that kind of power, what opportunities do they create for us in this room? What can we do? Well, I think oral history does offer a few opportunities, and I want to go through this, but then I kind of want us to have a conversation. But let me tell you a little bit about the opportunities that I think it provides for us. First, oral histories, in my opinion, offer the ability to democratize archives, point blank. You don't need a fireproof vault or a climate-controlled room to record someone's story. You need a recorder, a phone, a quiet room, and I'm sure any of my professional oral historians in the room might disagree with it, but I think you can do a voice memo if it's really about capturing it. And that means that we, in this room, can bring the archives to the people, to the shelters, to the churches, to the barbershops, to the front porches where, for the majority of my career, I've done the most of my oral histories, to wherever those stories are being told. But that would often require us moving outside of these beautiful walls. Second, I believe that oral histories have the ability and the power to restore agencies. When communities lose everything, their experiences aren't valued and they can often feel erased. But inviting them to tell those stories truly says, hey, you matter on your own terms. You have your own agency. We just simply want to help you preserve it. Your perspective is part of the record. Your memory belongs in history. You deserve, just like everyone else, to be here. But are we actually making that invitation? Third, I believe that oral histories have the power to build resilience. After trauma, regardless of where it might be, communities can often feel fractured and scattered, but collecting oral histories can help them stitch certain parts of the story back together. Listening circles, neighborhood recording projects, group oral history collecting ideas, community oral history labs. There's one in DC that's really fascinating and doing great work. All of these opportunities create spaces where people can see themselves reflected in this larger whole. And then finally, oral histories have the power, in my opinion, to broaden the meaning of survival after certain disasters and circumstances. Because if institutions survive by preserving paper and data, communities survive by preserving stories and memory. Oral histories ensure that the emotional truth is not lost when the physical evidence disappears. So imagine if every university archive saw oral history not as an optional program, but as a part of its regular existence. Additionally, maybe it's a part of your disaster response. Imagine if after every flood, hurricane, or wildfire, archivists all over the country went out with recorders in hand, not just helping to preserve what remains, but also capturing what cannot and should not be washed away. That would mean that archives and archivists are guardians and stewards of the past. But we're also partners in our futures and our survivals. So maybe the answer to my friend Eddie's question, what is the value of archives to those who've lost everything, is just simply this. Archives give us back our voice when we feel like we've lost it. And with that, I'd love to hear your voice. So I'm gonna pull my chair around and I'm gonna sit like a little fireside chat style. There's no fire in here, fireplaces or anything of the related, but I'm gonna pull my chair around and I would love to have just an honest conversation with all of you about your experiences. And if you think I'm crazy and well off base, you're welcome to say that too. But there's also time for questions. We have plenty of time for questions, just conversation. I have some prepared, but I also like to see if anyone would like to start. Yes.
To your point about like the importance of oral history, it just kind of reminded me of something I saw where it's the whole conversation about like whether or not audiobooks count as actual reading. But then if you think about like, well, what is like the ancestral way of communicating, and that's like through oral traditions and telling whether or not it was a story or passing down like a recipe or just a family ritual or process, like all of that was done orally through the voice. So, you know, I think that kind of gives importance to oral histories. So
I completely agree. Did you have it? I completely agree. And I think that sometimes we get caught, depending on your archival practice or librarian practice, sometimes I think we get caught in forgetting that the written word is a beautiful technology, but it's a Western technology. It's a fairly new Western technology. In other communities all over the world, not just historically, but in many communities all over the world, the oral tradition is the primary method of communication and translation, translation of knowledge, of recipes, as you said, of the family memory and knowledge. I have been told of a story in Accra, or outside of Accra in Ghana. There is a family friend of a friend, cousins, brother, auntie, them over there on that side, and a cousin of a cousin, a friend of a friend, however we want to call it. But in their village, there is a person who can, by just memory, recite like 17 generations of the village's history. And that's just how they do it. That's how they've always done it. That's how they're going to keep doing it. It wasn't written down. In fact, the idea of writing it down, you might offend someone because it's just not a part of their cultural practice. And so while I understand and appreciate the written word is a fairly modern tradition or fairly modern Western practice, I think the oral story, I think we've lost something if we don't include oral history and oral traditions as a part of our memory keeping practices as archivists. Just my 2 cents. You can also respond to each other.
So I have a statement, not necessarily a
Of course.
question, but I think when you posed the question, what do communities see the value in archives, I was thinking a matter of trust and relationship. And then the flip of that, archives is going to think, what value do we see in the community? Because archives and their policy or their kind of what thought process is that our what we collect is what we create. So it's kind of like, if we're not creating this community, then why would we preserve it? So if that relationship and that trust needs to start so that they both can see the value, so that both can start to share. Because there are community archives that are out there.
Absolutely.
And what comes to mind is the Native American archives. Like it takes them a long time to trust an archivist to invite them in their community. And even their archives is not always open to the public. But I think this question should start with the community archives that are already established. And then those community archives who can begin a relationship with the traditional archives. Because that trust doesn't come easy, especially with those marginalized communities that are like, well, what are you going to do with my stuff? Mm-hmm. Or will I have access to it? Or are you going to like take care of it? You know, so it is a matter of trust and relationship, and for them to build that relationship both ways, and for them to both can see the value.
Absolutely. I have a client who has a quote, and I thought it was very frustrating at first, but I've learned to really understand it. They move at the speed of trust. They move at the speed of trust. And that's it. It takes however long it takes. We'll let you know when we get there. In another book, not this book, but in a previous book that came out earlier this year, I kind of wrote about my personal philosophy on the recipe of trust. And it's show up, ask for nothing, offer nothing, say nothing, sit in the back quietly. Then show up again. Ask for nothing, offer nothing. Because the offer nothing is key. I think sometimes we come to outreach events, or I remember previously we would go to boys and girls events or neighborhood events or community organizations, nonprofits, and we would want to work with communities and to work in established partnerships. And I learned that why would they? They don't know us, they don't trust us. And so we learned to just show up to whatever the community was already doing and sit in the back. Sit there quietly. Do not offer anything. Do not ask for anything. Sit there quietly. The next community event, you show up again. You sit in the back. You sit there quietly. You don't ask for anything. You don't offer anything. But it was a consistency thing. If we kept showing up and we kept just being there and just being a part of the community, my goodness, novel idea. Eventually someone would say, who are you? Why are you here? And at the speed of trust, which is up to the community to decide what that means, but at the speed of trust, then we would maybe facilitate a partnership, or maybe they just say, okay, cool, you can stay. And that had to be good enough. I think sometimes in a traditional archives, we become the big table, and we start forcing our way on smaller repositories, community archives. But I think we have to be mindful of our positioning in the world and sometimes check ourselves. Just my 2 cents. But I wrote your comment down because I love that additional framing of the question. Yes. I saw it coming. I saw it in that. I was like, it's cool. It's cool.
So two things. I think on the question of value, it will be a question of money. And on the archives end, they're thinking of money as like how much yes, we already established, but the funding to take care of this, to add this, the space we're going to lose. And then on the other side, the people that are donating it, sometimes they don't want to release it. And so they're like, are you going to pay me for it? And then when it's a no, they don't establish that. So I know that's also a hindrance, and that's also something to think about, like money-wise and funding-wise.
Yeah.
But then you also mentioned like we also mentioned, community archives are already established, but I know that there are communities that trust their churches, and churches by default sometimes become archives because they keep those programs, they keep those wedding announcements. And so sometimes that's how traditional archives can also begin that pathway to those communities, is with the churches. And so it's like, you might not trust this name, but you trust this church, and you have this worship with them, and that can be established that way as well.
Absolutely. I have nothing more to add. I agree with you 100%. Sometimes our churches, and sometimes these church records, especially here in the South, these Southern church records have so much information in them. Thank you. Any other thoughts or comments, questions?
To piggyback off of that, you're probably aware of there was an article that came out of, I think, some grant forum discussions with community archivists, historians, that basically outlined an engagement framework and what they called parachuting in.
Mm-hmm.
Like, don't parachute in. It is all about the relationships and building that trust over time. I think one of the challenges in these institutions is broadly how it's perceived by various communities. Different communities, how it's perceived. And then also one in our profession, because people it takes a long time to build those relationships, and then you think about, is it the individual archivist building that relationship? Is it the archives itself building it? And how is the archives impacted by the perception of that institution? So it's like a cascading thing, and I think the article is called "Come Correct or Don't Come at All."
Yes, I read it.
Yeah, it's a good one. And the other thing is I really appreciated just talking about Western culture and also agency, because in some cultures there's a more value, or there's not such a value in legacy, and there is more of a value in the right to be forgotten. I cannot capture the story of my mother, for instance. For her, it's very much I don't see the point, and it may be a generational sort of thing too, but it is also cultural. Just to say, I think of one of the challenges here too is if there's a lens from a culture where it's we're not, I don't, trust even this being recorded at all, right? And so it really is living in the memory of descendants.
Absolutely. I actually speak on this all the time. I firmly believe in the right to be forgotten. I believe in the right to be remembered, absolutely. I do this work for a reason, but contrary to popular belief, I am a die-hard right to be forgotten person. Mostly because I believe in the right of self-choice and agency. You have the right to make whatever choice is best for you, or however you see fit, given whatever information that I can provide to you as an archivist around preservation practices, history making, keeping, libraries, archives. I can give you all the details and information, and if you decide that in your culture or in your individual family or in your individual personhood that you make the choice to be forgotten, I will help you do that. We will make sure that whatever preservation we can do doesn't happen. So I love that.
Yeah.
You go first.
I'm curious about that. Tanya might be talking about the same thing. Being a university campus and the students on this campus, I understand, I may be incorrect, that when they're here, they might be photographed by the university photographer and used in, it's sort of a written or unwritten contract, I don't know, that they are could potentially be part of the university's publications or, and I know we've had recently a student who had an interview in our student newspaper at the time, voluntarily did an interview, but now looking back, it's not a great look for him in his professional life, and is asking that to be, taken down. I don't know my question. As a university archivist, what is that, and especially in the age of social media, I thank God that social media didn't exist when I was in college. And what does that look like in a modern time, the right to be forgotten? I don't expect you to have the answer to that, but it's just a question and a conversation that came up while you were saying that. What does that look like in modern times, especially on a university campus? What is that?
You know, I don't have the answer to it. I just think that it is remarkably, it's exponentially more difficult now, the right to just move through lives and seasons, and not necessarily to be forgotten, but at least to just move through without being captured and recorded. I think there's actually like there's a line around preservation and active participation in preservation practices. I think there's also a line over here around the right to be forgotten, because there's choices and decisions that have to be made about that. But just existing, as you're saying, just walking around campus, you get photographed. You can't walk down the street in most downtowns without being captured on street cameras and bank cameras. I mean, I don't have an answer to it, because I know that it's not, for some people that's just not their choice. And I don't think that people should have to take extreme exclusionary practices of their own self-entity in order to just move through life under normal radar. I don't have an answer to it, but I know I feel very strongly about an average everyday person should not have to be ducking and diving. You know, walk into a restaurant every day because they choose of how they choose. You shouldn't have to live in your house all the time. My feelings on that one are very strong, but I don't have answers to them, like most things.
This is a completely different topic. It kind of goes back to archives, but not just archives. I would say faculty members inserting themselves into communities. And several years ago, Wake Forest did one of the most valuable conferences I have ever attended. I refer to it all the time. It was called Universities and the Neighborhood. And basically it was about the development of the Innovation Quarter, which was an intrusion into a Black working class neighborhood. It was about faculty members who, I'm not blaming academic faculty here, but who might have research projects, documentary film projects, other projects, and they go in and then they leave. And some of the panels were community members who had been left and talking about the trauma of that. And there were some faculty members there, and then there were people also in the Winston-Salem community that talked about that. And I think the faculty were just really surprised. And I think that it was just to hear them talk about the trauma of being left or feeling abandoned, that someone had come in and promised a project and promised all these, remember, say nothing, promise nothing, promised them things, and then they never received them and then never saw them again. And they talked about that, and I will never, ever forget it. I will, if anybody's interested, I will share the video of at least one talk. They didn't video the panels, because of privacy, they didn't video the panels, but it was, you have to be really, really careful about how you present yourself and what is your place.
And I think, even if I add on to that, I agree 100%. It's one of my pet peeves. But I would add on to that, ooh, please invite me back one day. I like it here. I'm going to say what I'm going to say. How do I phrase it? I think that there can also be a privilege to study other people.
Yeah.
That is weird. Like, it's weird. There's a level of privilege that exists to be able to categorically separate. There's like this ethnographic study version that happens that you can observe and
dip in and dip out.
Dip in and dip out, and to study other people, communities, or practices for analytical purposes, for whatever it is a privilege in itself, in my opinion, personally.
Going off what you're saying, it reminds me of when people are doing research studies. Like,
it's weird.
there's forms that need to be signed. There's ethical practices and different things like that. So when you have people who are in communities, basically they're doing research studies, or they're getting information and presenting. what forms need to be signed, what ethical questions, that
Yes.
they're bypassing all of that.
They
And
often.
you're right, it is a privilege. There's also an intimacy
It
that
is.
people are inviting you into my home, I'm inviting you to something sacred, I'm inviting you to this space, and to take it so lightly, there should be a practice, like, I'm pretty sure there probably is, but there should be some legal parameters or some people or something that, when those things happen, people have to.
And I've been even saying a step further, again, I'm a rebel rouser, please invite me back, I like that. But there's also a step further that says, should certain entities of privileged institutions even be allowed to do such practices? Like, the idea that you can, for lack of a word, parachute in and study human beings and then go back and have dinner with your family and kids, it creates this dichotomy that the communities that you're studying might not actually have. And so in some ways you're benefiting from your tenured position, you're benefiting from the ability to study other human beings. It's weird.
And it's been done before
It's been
in
done
a
all the
negative way, where a lot of the people weren't aware of what research was being done.
Absolutely, not the true
Right.
intentions behind the research. And so what ethical practices need to be in place, I'm not sure, but I do think that sometimes the archive gets caught up in that, to be honest, because we end up sometimes, depending on the institution and the institution's retention practices, oftentimes faculties, I don't know how Wake Forest does it, but oftentimes faculty publications technically end up belonging to the university, unless they intentionally write it out, right? Or it's like anything that you write or produce while you're on faculty at the university belongs as the intellectual property of the university. There's usually something like that in the language of your contracts. And so sometimes when a faculty member retires, their entire office can come to the archive, and it can sometimes include some of that very sensitive research ends up in manuscript boxes in our collections. And so do we facilitate researcher access to these collections? I think we shouldn't, but it depends on every university, because it was research produced technically by the university under their policies, protocols, and procedures. And if it's been a certain amount of time, or it's been X, Y, Z, here we are pushing our carts full of manuscript boxes to researchers who are even now, in my opinion, further removed from the community that was originally exposed, and now that's being serviced to additional. I mean, it gets where sometimes the archives can become complacent in a little bit of that, but I think it furthers adds to trauma, but it's just my 2 cents. But unfortunately, I think we're at time.
We just asked if anyone had any comments. We have at least almost up to 7 people watching online, but no questions or comments.
Okay.
But I do want to thank Dominique
Oh,
for
thank
such,
you all.
and you are welcome to come back anytime you want.